Alright, hey everyone, my name is Yazan. I'm a junior at the University of Michigan. So I don't have a PowerPoint, all I have is this sheet of paper. But at least there'd be no technical difficulties except for my handwriting. Alright, so basically what I wanted to talk about today was kind of a lot about myself, kind of like how I'm Syrian by origin, and kind of how the situation over there has impacted my personal development and what I think of as my identity. So just a bit of background on who I am. My parents are Syrian, we're from Dimashq, a neighborhood called Midan, but as a kid I moved around a lot. I was born in Chicago, lived in Detroit till I was 5, I lived in Syria for 4 years, then Jeddah, Saudi Arabia for 2 years, and while I was in Syria, I was in Mesde, not in Midan, which is where my father was from. But then after that, lived in Fargo, North Dakota for 2 years, and then Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where I went to the American International School in Riyadh from 8th grade till 12th grade, and my parents still lived there, right? So very much, I'm not a first generation Arab American as some other people here might be, in the sense that my parents came here as immigrants and I was born here, but I'm not first generation the same way, I'm not a first generation immigrant, whatever the term is, the same way other people might be, because I was born here, I have had some exposure, just lived the majority of my life out in Saudi Arabia, right? But I think it's kind of interesting, the experience that I've had, because I went to an American International School in Riyadh. So even then, you're not really, the education that you're given isn't the same education that you're given in a normal public school. So in a class, maybe in history, we'd learn about US history, right? We'd learn about world history. So the kind of education that we got at school was very depoliticized, kind of disattached from the context of where we were living. So I remember, as somebody growing up in Saudi Arabia, I didn't even know what the geopolitical situation was like. Mubarak knew the name but didn't know anything about the Egyptian government, didn't know anything about Ali Abdullah Saleh, Bin Ali, all the things that happened, right? And even in terms of Syria, whenever my parents, every Arab family is very political, they have conversations, but then my parents never really brought it to the kids. And they'd watch Al Jazeera, but I never really paid attention to it. So even when I thought of Syria, I didn't have the same views that I had right now. So just to give you an anecdote, in high school, I remember I was having a kind of an argument with one of my friends who was Lebanese, and they were just going, whose country is better? So he brought up the issue of, oh, your country's ruled by a dictator. I'm like, no, Bashar is elected, what are you talking about, right? And another actually no more anecdotes, but let's see. Okay, but I wanted to just bring up this thing about being depoliticized, because I feel like that's an experience a lot of other Arabs and Arab Americans have had, in the sense that even if they cared about their identity, they didn't really know much about the politics, or they weren't very heavily involved. So once the Arab Spring started happening, it got a lot of media attention, West and in the Middle East. And for me personally, that was the first time I started reading up on this stuff. I found out what Bashar was, all the names of the dictators started, I know them like the back of my hand, all that. And I started reading up on history, and in the sense that really kind of, it strengthened your identity as being Arab. Another thing that I would say, let's see, what else do I have in my notes? Learn about language. Okay. But yeah, so it got me and other people to start thinking about the Arab Spring. And by thinking about it and then starting to get involved with activism surrounding Syria, surrounding Egypt, that I felt strengthened your identity, because now you were more than just an Arab just because your culture, your parents. Now you're being kind of a productive citizen, and that you're doing something to change the government, right? And another thing is, as far as political consciousness and how that has changed with the Arab Spring, is I remember as far as even with my grandparents, right? The way that their whole vision of the Middle East was that you have all these dictators, and this is just an eternal situation. It's never going to change, right? So when Mubarak fell, that was it was a huge thing, right? And now people's concept of the situation around you, now governments can change. People do have a role to change that kind of stuff, right? And so that just reminded me of the thing that you brought up in the very beginning, and then the change with the revolutions. A lot of stuff we haven't seen the fruit of what happened, but really there was a change in a shift in mindset with people and how they perceived their situation. So that was the very beginning, and one thing that other people have touched on is that kind of arc that has happened with the Arab Spring. When everything was started good, everyone was happy, but in specific with Syria, just to talk about that arc, I'm all over the place right now, but it's fine. Hopefully you get something. But so just to keep going with that theme of like changing your own mindset. I remember even with Syrian Americans over here in the University of Michigan, we wanted to start doing stuff. So Syria started March 15, right? There were protests surrounding Egypt at the University of Michigan, January 28, right? But then between March 15 and the start of that until like the semester of my sophomore year in the fall, there were really not that much conversation about Syria, and people were like, why is this such a hush topic? A lot of that had to go back with people didn't really take the initiative upon themselves. Around the Syrian American community, there was a lot of fear that was inherited from our parents. You know, you didn't know much about the politics, but at the same time it was very taboo to bring it up. And you'd hear stories about maybe family friends who went in a protest in Washington. The next week, they got a letter from the Syrian embassy telling them to go over there. And you'd even hear stories about people here, like I've heard stories about people here in Dearborn who would take pictures of people at protests and then send them to the Syrian embassy, right? So when the first protest that Abbas mentioned, that happened in the fall, to me that was a kind of big step forward in the sense that kind of broke a barrier of fear that was internalized in us as a community outside of Syria. And slowly, stuff like that became normalized. It wasn't taboo to talk about it anymore. That's a huge change in itself, right? But then, as a lot of you guys can relate, stuff in Syria dragged on. It became a lot more violent. Wasn't the same kind of peaceful protests that happened before, and it became muddled with a lot of different types of politics, where are you anti-imperialist, are you pro-imperialist, are you for intervention, which I felt like alienated a lot of people. And then all the images that were coming from Syria, people became saturated with it. So that is the kind of arc that I'm talking about, where as first people really became involved with Syria, then they started being alienated, moving away from it, you know? And as far as like, just, here, what am I saying? That's the American Museum. Yeah. So just as far as like difficulties with activism around Syria, one of it is breaking that kind of indifference that has been built up because people have seen so many images. How do you reach somebody who doesn't like want to hear about it anymore? And then another thing is like just for you personally, because yeah, Betsy brought up the thing about Palestine and Egypt. There was a clear link in that the U.S. government was funding the Israeli government, military occupation, same way it was funding Mubarak. So as far as like Egyptian Americans or like Arab Americans doing activism around Egypt, it's easy to see your role in how you want change over there because you are implicated in somewhat just by being an American citizen, right? But whereas being a Syrian American and you want to do some activism around Syria, it's a lot more complicated because the U.S. government doesn't fund the Syrian regime, right? And if you wanna, and it's hard to balance between being for the Syrian people and then going a little too far and then being pro-American, even though these things like they're not always the same. So what I mean by that is like, how do you say you want some kind of solution to Syria without calling for maybe an intervention led by the U.S., which you think might be problematic for some reason, for many reasons. And the other thing is like, as far as with the situation in Syria, everyone knows like there isn't really a unified opposition is kind of a huge mess, and the fact that that's not unified doesn't give you a good landscape to do activism around, because then what kind of messages do you want to give out? You know, there's no consensus, right? And so in a sense, it becomes fragmented. So as far as like my personal identity, just to sum up basically, I'd call it an arc where first, I would always say I'm Syrian, because in Saudi Arabia, if somebody asks you where you're from, it's not like here where you say I'm from West Bloomfield, I'm from Dearborn. You wouldn't say you're from Riyadh, because nobody's really Saudi, even if they live there, right? So you call yourself Syrian, but it was just very nominal, you know, you like the culture and everything, but then with the Arab Spring, you started thinking more critically about what your role is in contrast to, you know, what the political situation is, right? But then as it kept going, and then you kind of, as the situation in Syria got a little more dire, a little more complicated, you start questioning your role in relationship to it. So what I mean is, when I was talking about like there's no clear consensus about how to act in regards to Syria with over there. So if you're doing activism around Syria over here in the United States, how do you know that the stuff that you're saying is really representative or for the people who are living over there? The experiences of me and the people who are over there just become so vastly different that I don't have as much of an authority or anything to say about what's going to happen in that region. So in a sense, that creates a gap, right? But yeah, that's pretty much all. Thank you.